This film is for informational and educational purposes only. It does not aim to advertise, promote, or suggest any specific conduct. Case number 14, The Room Under the Lake. He built a palace, and then he hid a room beneath a lake. The only sign on the surface was a stone statue of Neptune that seemed to float on the water. When his guests gathered below, in a glass chamber sunk into the lake bed, the smoke from their cigars drifted up and out through the open mouth of the god. This is the story of the man who built that room, the fortune he claimed to have found, and the fortune he never really had. His name was James Whitaker Wright, and he was born on the 9th of February, 1846, the son of a Methodist minister in the English Midlands. He grew up surrounded by sermons about honesty and salvation. For a brief time, he even preached himself, following his father into the pulpit before ill health pushed him out. He worked as a printer, tried his hand at small businesses, and watched them fail. The young man who would one day swindle a nation began life with nothing but ambition and a gift for talk. When his father died in 1870, the family crossed the Atlantic, settling first in Canada and then in the United States. America was booming, and the boom that mattered most was buried in the ground. The western frontier was tearing itself open in search of gold and silver, and fortunes were being made and lost overnight in places few people could find on a map. Wright, restless and quick, drifted toward the noise of the mining camps. He had found his stage. In the silver towns of the American West, in Leadville, Colorado, and Lake Valley, New Mexico, Wright discovered his true talent. It was not digging for ore, it was selling the idea of ore. He promoted silver mining companies, talked up their prospects, and sold shares to hopeful investors. The mines themselves rarely delivered. Time and again, the companies he floated failed to return a single profitable dividend to the people who had trusted him. The shareholders lost. Somehow, Wright did not. He married, he prospered, and he learned the most dangerous lesson of his life, that the appearance of wealth could be more valuable than wealth itself. A confident man in a good suit, speaking with certainty about a mine no one could see, could move money simply by being believed. Wright understood that better than almost anyone alive. By the end of the 1880s, he had decided that the real money was not in America's dusty camps at all. It was in London, the financial capital of the world. In 1889, Whitaker Wright returned to England, no longer a failed printer, but a polished financier with American gold in his patter. London in the 1890s was hungry for exactly what he was selling. The empire stretched across the globe, and investors dreamed of distant mines in Australia, Canada, and Africa pouring riches back home. Wright became a company promoter, a man who created companies, sold their shares, and took his cut. He had a genius for it. Within a few years, he was one of the most talked about financiers in the city of London. At the center of his web, he placed a single grand company, the London and Globe Finance Corporation. Floated in 1897 with a capital of £2 million in £1 shares, it was meant to be the steady hub of his empire, a respectable finance house lending strength to a constellation of mining ventures around it. Wright took hundreds of thousands of those shares for himself and made himself managing director. On paper, London and Globe looked like solid British money. In truth, it was the beating heart of a machine designed to keep an illusion alive. To make it all look respectable, Wright did what clever frauds have always done. He borrowed the good names of better men. As chairman of the London and Globe, he installed the Marquis of Dufferin and Ava, a celebrated statesman and a former Viceroy of India. A man who had governed an empire now lent his title to a mining promoter's prospectus. Other lords and dignitaries sat on his boards. They gave him the one thing money cannot easily buy, the assumption of honesty. Few of them understood what was really happening to the accounts. The shares soared. Wright's most famous holding, a West Australian gold venture whose name carried the ring of solid government bonds, was traded by speculators who knew almost nothing about the rock beneath it. Crowds gathered when his company's prices moved. Newspapers reported his every venture. Wright had become a maker of fortunes, a man whose word could send a share price climbing. And with the money rolling in, real or imagined, he set about building himself a kingdom on English soil that would dazzle anyone who saw it. In 1890, he bought a sprawling estate in the Surrey countryside called Lee Park, and he renamed it Whitley Park. Then he began to remake it on a scale that bordered on madness. At its height, the estate stretched across thousands of acres. The mansion swelled to 32 bedrooms with a great ballroom, a private theatre, an observatory, and rooms enough to lose a guest in. Armies of labourers reshaped the land itself, moving hills, planting forests, and carving out 3 enormous artificial lakes where there had been dry ground before. The cost was staggering. The land alone had cost £250,000, and the works that followed are estimated to have swallowed more than £1 million more, a fortune large enough in that era to build a town. Hills were levelled and rebuilt to improve the view. Whole trees were transplanted full-grown. And beneath the largest of the new lakes, Wright ordered the construction of the strangest feature of all, the one that would outlive his fame and his crime, and that still lies there, drowned and forgotten, today. Beneath the lake he built a glass chamber, sunk into the lake bed and reached by a glazed tunnel and a stone staircase. It was a domed conservatory and smoking room ringed with windows, so that anyone inside could look up and out into the green water of the lake itself. Fish drifted past the glass. On bright days, swimmers passed overhead. Legend says guests played billiards there in a connected room, while the dome above them held back tons of water. It was a folly without equal in England, a room where you could smoke a cigar at the bottom of a lake. Above it all stood the statue of Neptune. To anyone strolling the lakeshore, the god of the sea appeared to stand on the surface of the water, trident in hand, with no hint of the chamber hidden beneath. But the statue had a secret purpose. It was hollow, and it was vented to the room below. When Wright's guests sat smoking in the chamber under the lake, the smoke from their cigars rose up through the dome and drifted out, it was said, through the open mouth of Neptune himself. The whole estate was a monument to a single idea, that Whitaker Wright was a man of limitless wealth. But the kingdom rested on nothing. The truth, hidden behind Wright's confident accounts, was that his mining companies were bleeding money. The great gold ventures were not pouring out the riches their share prices promised. And so Wright kept the illusion alive the only way he could. He moved money. From one company to another, he pushed sums disguised as loans, shifting cash around his empire so that whichever company needed to look healthy could always show a balance. It was a shell game, played with the savings of thousands of investors. When the time came to publish accounts, Wright simply made them say what he wanted. He exaggerated the value of the mines his companies owned. He left liabilities off the books entirely. He counted loans between his own companies as if they were genuine assets, real wealth flowing in, when in fact it was the same depleted money circling round and round. The balance sheets that reassured the public were carefully composed fictions. To an ordinary shareholder reading a glowing annual report, the London and Globe looked rich. It was, in reality, sinking. The losses were not small. In a single West Australian gold company, Wright's group dropped around £750,000 in the space of a year. Across his empire, the holes were widening faster than even his juggling could hide. To keep paying dividends, the visible proof that all was well, he had to keep finding money from somewhere, and the only somewhere left was the savings of new investors and the dwindling reserves of his own companies. It was the oldest trap in finance. Sooner or later, the music had to stop. Wright's ambitions had reached even beneath the streets of London. His London and Globe had taken on the funding of a new underground railway, the Baker Street and Waterloo Line, a deep tube being bored through the clay under the capital. It was a vast and modern undertaking, and it depended on his money to be built. As his empire weakened, the railway it was meant to finance slowed and faltered with it. The fate of a London tube line was now tied to the secret fictions in a fraudster's account books. Then, in the last days of December 1900, the machine finally seized. On the 28th of December, the London and Globe Finance Corporation announced that it could not meet its obligations. It was insolvent. The news tore through the city like a fire. As Wright's central company fell, the firms tied to it fell with it, a chain of around 13 stock exchange businesses crashing in a single cascade. Panic gripped the trading floor. The man who had made fortunes was suddenly revealed to have been losing them all along. When the wreckage was added up, the scale of it stunned the nation. Across Wright's tangle of companies, the losses ran to roughly £5 million in capital, a sum that in today's money would reach into the hundreds of millions. Some later estimates, counting the full ruin across all 13 promoted firms, put the destruction even higher, at around £8 million. Whatever the precise figure, the meaning was the same. Thousands of ordinary shareholders were wiped out. Creditors recovered only a fraction. A great deal of money had simply vanished into a man's vanity. There were demands for answers. Questions about the crash were raised in Parliament. Angry shareholders wanted to know how a company chaired by a former Viceroy of India, audited and reported and praised, could have been hollow all along. Investigators began to pick through the books, and the deeper they dug, the worse it looked. The loans that were not really loans, the assets that were not really assets, the profits that had never existed. Slowly, the carefully built illusion was being taken apart, page by page. Whitaker Wright did not wait to find out where the investigation would lead. As the net began to close, he ran. He slipped out of England and made for France, then boarded a steamer from Le Havre bound for New York, traveling under a false name. He hoped to disappear into America, the country where he had first learned his trade. But the world had changed since his youth in the silver camps. A new technology had stretched across the ocean, and it would prove to be his undoing. Even as Wright crossed the Atlantic, the authorities were sending word ahead of him. A warrant for his arrest was telegraphed to New York, racing across the ocean far faster than any ship could sail. When his steamer docked, the police were waiting. The false name did not save him. He was arrested on American soil and held, while two governments argued over what to do with him. The man who had once vanished into the frontier could no longer outrun the wire. Wright fought extradition for months, his lawyers stretching the case through the American courts, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. In the summer of 1903, he gave up the fight and returned to England to face justice. He came back not as the Lord of Whitley Park, but as a defendant, his name now a byword for ruin. Ahead of him lay the highest court in the land, a jury of his countrymen, and a reckoning he had spent years trying to escape. The trial opened in January 1904 at the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, the great Gothic palace of English law. Wright faced a long list of charges of fraud brought under the Larceny Act, centered on the false accounts of the London and Globe. The case was heard before Mr. Justice Bigham, a sharp and experienced judge who would later be ennobled as Lord Mersey. Leading the prosecution was one of the finest barristers of the age, Rufus Isaacs, a man destined himself to rise to the very top of the legal world. Day after day, the prosecution laid the fraud bare. They walked the jury through the balance sheets and showed how the figures had been arranged to deceive. They traced the loans that circled between Wright's companies, money that looked like profit but was only the same shrinking pool moving in a ring. They showed how the value of the mines had been inflated and the debts quietly hidden. Wright's defense insisted he had done only what company promoters always did. The accounts, line by careful line, told a different story. The trial ran for the better part of 2 weeks. Through it all, Wright remained composed. The same confident manner that had once charmed the city now turned toward the men deciding his fate. But the evidence was overwhelming. On the 26th of January 1904, the jury returned its verdict. On count after count, the answer was the same: guilty. After years of running and arguing and denying, Whitaker Wright stood convicted as a fraud, his ruin now a matter of law as well as of money. Then came the sentence. Mr. Justice Bigham looked down at the man who had built a palace and a room beneath a lake on other people's money, and he handed down 7 years of penal servitude, 7 years of hard prison labor for one of the most respected financiers London had ever celebrated. It was a steep fall, but to many of the ruined shareholders watching from the gallery, it must have felt like justice at last. Wright took the sentence quietly. He did not intend to serve a single day of it. After the sentence was read, Wright was led to a private consultation room inside the courts, where he was allowed to speak with his legal advisors before being taken to prison. Security in those days was loose. No one had searched him. In the quiet of that room, away from the eyes of the court, Wright did something he had clearly planned. He asked for a whiskey and lit a cigar, the picture of a calm man. And then, with no warning, he reached into his coat and swallowed a small capsule he had carried hidden against this very moment. The capsule held cyanide of potassium, one of the swiftest poisons known. It acted almost at once. Within moments, Wright collapsed, and before his lawyer or anyone else could do a thing to save him, he was dead. He had cheated his sentence in the most final way imaginable, taking his own life inside the highest court in England, minutes after it had condemned him. The man who built a room under a lake had chosen the time and place of his own ending. When officials examined his body, they found something that turned a tragedy into a chilling tableau. Tucked into a pocket was a six-chambered revolver, fully loaded and cocked. Wright had carried a loaded gun through his entire final day in court, a second way out if the poison should fail him. He had come to that courtroom prepared to die rather than be imprisoned, and he had planned it with the same cold thoroughness he had once brought to cooking his accounts. The poison had simply been the quieter of his two exits. The news flashed around the world. From Melbourne to New York, newspapers reported in disbelief that the convicted financier had dropped dead within the courts the very hour of his sentence. An inquest confirmed the truth. Whitaker Wright had poisoned himself with cyanide of potassium. He was buried in the churchyard at Whitley, not far from the lake and the drowned chamber he had built. His grave still stands there, the last marker of a man who had reached for an empire and grasped only ruin. His death did not undo the damage. Thousands of investors never recovered their savings. The underground railway his money had nearly built was rescued only when a different financier stepped in and finished the line, which opened in 1906 and runs to this day as the Baccaloo. Whitley Park itself passed to new owners. The great mansion burned down in the 20th century and was demolished, and the kingdom Wright had carved into the Surrey hills slowly faded back into ordinary countryside. But beneath the largest lake, the strangest part of his folly endured. The glass chamber still lies there, drowned and silent, its dome holding back the water as it has for more than a century. The statue of Neptune still keeps watch on the surface. No more cigar smoke rises through his open mouth, and no guests gather behind the glass to watch the fish drift past. There is only the cold, green water, and the room under the lake, the last secret of a man who built a fortune out of nothing and took poison rather than lose it. Whitaker Wright had understood, better than almost anyone of his age, that belief could be worth more than gold. He had built his whole empire on the confidence of strangers, on names borrowed from lords, on accounts arranged to flatter. And when the confidence finally broke, there was nothing underneath to catch him. He had spent a fortune that never truly existed to build a palace with a room beneath a lake, and in the end, the only thing that proved real was the poison in his coat. Case number 14 closed.